becoming aware of just like the starvation mode of all of this is really important. Really seeing how we can be like starving, salivating dogs who are seeing and hearing bells, but never know when they're actually going to receive the reward, and are so desperate for any kind of reward that they'll just take anything to satiate the craving that has been triggered. That's a very real issue that I think summarizes a lot of different problems that I've run into in my life. A lot of different problems I've run into can be summarized in that sentence that I just said that I totally forgot. I don't even remember what I just said. Great. Hello. Tonight, I wanted to make a video about triggers. And you may be thinking to yourself, I know exactly what you're talking about, Erin. Nay, you do not. Actually, you might, I have no fucking idea. But the type of triggers that I want to talk about tonight are actually not the normal type of triggers that you hear about or that I hear about. I actually wanted to talk about craving triggers. And more specifically than craving triggers, I actually just wanted to talk about why craving triggers even happen, because this is something that I've come to realize myself recently. I think I knew bits and pieces of it. Like, I was aware that there were triggers that I had that caused craving. I knew that part already. I've been very freaking aware of it for a very long time because I've known what I've needed to do to deal with the craving once it's been triggered. And I've also developed all of these tools for myself personally, which might not even be the best, but you know, it's like when you're in the middle of like a raging river and there's no one else around, you have to kind of just come up with your own stuff. And it really is amazing the different tools that the brain will come up with to figure out how to cope with things in order to basically like survive something really terrible not happening. So I have formed my own like haphazard tools for myself to figure out how to deal with the craving, to get through the craving. I've basically come to realize that the craving triggers happen for a very specific reason. And I really do believe that this comes down to something very similar to basically like classical conditioning. If you're not aware of classical conditioning, the biggest and most well-known example for classical conditioning is actually Pavlov's dogs. So if you haven't heard of Pavlov's dogs, basically there's this dude named Pavlov. He probably had a first name. What was his first name? This dude's first name was Ivan. So Ivan Pavlov did this experiment back in the, when was this done? Bro, I know like nothing about this. This was done in the 1890s by a dude named Ivan Pavlov, and he basically took dogs. He actually did a bunch of really unethical experiments on animals. Like, as a person on the whole, he was not great. Would not recommend. Actual potential serial killer in my mind from the way that he tortured animals, but I digress. Anyway, he did a really well-known experiment where basically he taught dogs to become trained to where when they heard the sound of a bell, they would salivate whether there was food present or not. The way that he managed to do this was by first exposing the dogs to the sound of a bell while there actually was food, then slowly training them to realize if they heard the sound of the bell, they would be receiving food, so that eventually they would salivate when they heard the sound of a bell. That is classical conditioning in a nutshell. Classical conditioning is something that is used in advertising all the freaking time. It's very prevalent in society if you really learn how to spot it. Different brands will use different colors, different jingles, things like that. Those are all used to condition us to have different emotional responses to the things that they're trying to advertise to us. That's just one way that classical conditioning is used. It shows up in a lot of different aspects of life. I'm honestly not familiar with all of them. But when I was thinking about my craving triggers and how they happen within the sphere of people that I crave who are not healthy for me, situations that I crave that are not healthy for me, what I really have come to realize is that a lot of classical conditioning actually occurs within these toxic, abusive, and dysfunctional relationships that we're inside of. And so I really wanted to kind of expand upon that today, because me realizing that has been actually very, very helpful for me on almost a deeper level. Because before, yes, I knew that there were times where I'm like, okay, I've been triggered, a craving has been triggered, and now I need to do different things to mitigate that craving until it passes, right? Just like with any other classical conditioning sort of trigger, where maybe you're exposed to what I would almost call a signal. And then after you've been exposed to the signal, you might crave food, you might crave a drug, you might crave a cigarette, you might crave different things that aren't good for you, and then you almost have to wait for that craving to pass, right? Same sort of thing happens within these types of relationships, and I think we just aren't aware of it. And I think it's really important to be aware of it because, once again, we're living in a world that encourages us to take all of our feelings at face value and basically say to ourselves, oh, I suddenly am having this impulse, I suddenly am having this desire for this thing. I should just take that at face value and assume that that has merit, and I should pursue that thing because I magically want to pursue this thing. And the things that I want are good. The things that I want bring me pleasure, bring me comfort. So if I crave them, if I want them, they must be good for me because I want them, so I am going to pursue them. A lot of people really only kind of exist on this surface level with themselves and their own thoughts and their own desires. And in a world that uses our emotions and uses our desires against us to capitalize on us, to monopolize on us, you know, we have to learn not to do that for a whole slew of reasons, addiction aside. So, one thing that I wanted to discuss today was just what different signals might look like within these relationships. Again, just to define a signal again. When I'm saying signal, I'm basically talking about the behavior that someone might exhibit towards us. So typically a signal within classical conditioning would be a sound, a symbol, a color. Like I said, in marketing, oftentimes it's a jingle, a color, different things like that. Within the sphere of a relationship, I think the signals are more so behaviors that the person elicits towards us. They signal towards us. And again, I don't think they're even aware of it. These things are very subconscious, but it's like being trained by someone. So they signal towards us a certain thing, and we eventually become ingrained to have these very automated, almost like physical reactions to their signals. And those obviously work to our detriment, obviously work against us, especially if we do not realize that we've essentially been conditioned. We're having a conditioned response to a signal, not an authentic, real response to something that we truly actually want for ourselves, but it is actually a conditioned response. It's an automated conditioned response. And you being aware of that, I now actively work on undoing those conditioned responses inside of myself, and it's surprisingly freaking hard, dude. So that was the first thing that I wanted to kind of define. When I'm saying signal, I'm talking about something deeper than an object or a jingle. It's an actual kind of behavior from a person. Another way that I think we can define signaling is that we are being taught to have positive reactions. Positive in the sense that it's a reward for the other person. We're having positive reactions to inappropriate behavior. Many of the signals within our dysfunctional relationships actually are very inappropriate behaviors. And I think this is why, to people on the outside, when they look inside of a dysfunctional, toxic, or abusive relationship, they are shocked at the things that we are having positive reactions to, because they are not conditioned. They have not been conditioned to have these kind of automated conditioned responses that we do. So when they see us having these conditioned responses, these positive conditioned responses to something that to them is so obviously inappropriate, they can't understand that. They can't understand it in the sense that we're even doing it. And I think that also the massive impulse control issues that we develop with these classically conditioned responses is also shocking to them. Not only how it occurs, but how instantaneously it can occur with us. It's really like a switch being flipped, which pretty much is what classical conditioning can do. Another thing I wanted to try and hone in on is when I'm saying positive responses, when we look at what the responses are that we start to have, just to define those a little bit, I would say it's very extreme submissiveness. I think it starts out as just submissiveness, and then over time, because of course they're never satisfied with just us being mildly submissive, they want the most the best form of submissiveness, right? And all of these things tend to kind of like snowball and become more extreme. They tend to become more and more angry. We tend to become more and more submissive. All of it becomes more extreme over time. So I would say submissiveness and extreme submissiveness are one of the positive responses that we have to inappropriate behavior. I would also say that anxiety, anxiousness, shutting down, fawning, just trying to pacify them in any way possible, which is a version of submissiveness, but really it's very much like an anxiety response, which can look like a lot of different things for different people. But that type of instant anxiety, which is a whole body response, obviously, is another sort of like positive reaction that they want, because it causes us to shut down, stop being able to assess our own environment, stop being able to think on a more intellectual, cognitive level. Like when I'm in an argument with someone, this still happens to me, to where if they start throwing out too many things that are kind of like triggers for me, I will stop being able to think clearly and form my own thoughts and work through what it is that I'm actually trying to articulate for them. I will become seriously inhibited in that. And it will take me a while after the argument to come back down enough to where I can begin working through my thoughts myself again. That, I think, is another very like classically conditioned thing inside of myself. From being in many of these different types of relationships, it's a knee-jerk reaction that my mind has now. And that also is literally being triggered. I understand that that's also just literally how people respond when they are triggered. But I think it's also a type of classically conditioned response from a different aspect, where like they encourage us to act this way. So I think it occurs for several different reasons, not just one. I think another positive reaction that we tend to have to their inappropriate behavior, or their signals, is reliant behavior, emotionally reliant behavior, where, they might signal something sort of signaling helplessness, signaling whatever might elicit a kind of like codependent type reaction in us, to where when I say reliant on them, what I'm really saying is that we become emotionally dependent on making sure that they are okay. One of the videos that I made on the helpless child and the way that con artists of sorts, because I do view a lot of these guys as con artists, the helpless child, I think, is one of the most effective signals that are used within these relationships to trigger a codependent reaction inside of us, a caretaker reaction inside of us that causes us to want to caretake and make sure that they are okay so that we can be okay. That is very much, in my mind, a way of being reliant on them, to where now we no longer feel like anything's going to be okay until they are okay. And that caretaker response inside of me, it not only creates a feeling of like fragility inside of me, to where I feel like I can't be okay until they're okay, but I think on another level, it's also kind of like a drug that I start craving. Because if any of you have struggled with codependency, you absolutely can get endorphins out of that. And I think a lot of times that cycle of like them hurting us and then us caretaking and us almost being required to caretake for things to even out and for the honeymoon stage and the pink cloud of everything to return briefly before it becomes horrible again, that is a massive reward that we get at the end after caretaking. So there is kind of this like endorphin, dopamine type reward that we start expecting and craving when that kind of like helpless signal is shown to us. Another aspect to that, so that's been explained, the whole idea of what a signal is, how they might signal, and I'll go into how they might even signal towards us, what their signals might look like. But they signal towards us. We have these different types of conditioned responses that happen slowly over time. And then if you really think about it, that video that I made on how grooming breaks the mind, really what I'm describing in that video from lots of different aspects is how if you live inside of these relationships for a substantial amount of time and then you leave, you are now, let's say you weren't conditioned beforehand, you went into this relationship completely your own person, because people do that. Like, there are people who don't come from abuse, who weren't sort of exposed to these different types of signals and messaging in their childhood. Some people were. And so you're already rewired and primed for abuse because of that. But some people don't come from those types of backgrounds, and they are not already primed and rewired for this type of conditioning. And to have these kinds of like appropriate responses to these signals, they can still be broken down to where they are rewired and they are primed for the next person. And so really, in my video where I talk about how grooming breaks the mind, I didn't really piece it together from this aspect back then, but looking at that video now and thinking about it, that really is kind of what I'm describing as a person whose brain has been rewired and broken down enough to where once they get out of one relationship that has conditioned them to have positive reactions to inappropriate behavior, they're now already in the perfect mindset for the next person who might come along with the same types of signals, looking for someone who's going to have positive reactions to inappropriate behavior. And obviously, I've already described this from several different aspects in my videos, but I really think when you look at it from the perspective of classical conditioning, it's very helpful, specifically because of the craving triggers that can happen for us. Like, I think it might not necessarily matter for all the other aspects where we become broken down, because you can understand those just from the sense of being broken down as a person. But these craving triggers are a very specific phenomenon that I think a lot of people on the outside who haven't been through these experiences might not understand. I mean, it's very strange when you think about it. If you haven't been through something like this, it would be very strange to watch someone be in a relationship like this, get out of a relationship like this, and then they basically, as an outsider, might observe the past person or a new person exhibit a behavior that seems very fairly benign, if not inappropriate, and to watch their friend or their loved one suddenly almost revert back into a former self that they had seemed to have grown out of. You know, you're watching this person do all this work, you're watching this person do, healing in a lot of different ways. And I can imagine how strange that would be to be sitting on the outside. And after one tiny interaction of whatever form, either from the ex-person, the ex-boyfriend, the ex-girlfriend, either from the ex or from a new person, after one simple interaction, to watch the person that you care about completely regress in some form or another into their past self. That has to be very confusing to witness. So when I'm thinking about why am I making this video, I'm making it for several different reasons. One, just because it's interesting and it's helpful to know. But also, I think this hopefully will cause people to have sympathy for when we talk about people who are just choosing to not leave. There's so much more going on in these relationships than them just not choosing to leave. Obviously, people will talk about how, like, if you share kids together, there's the potential of the kids' safety being threatened. If you don't have the money to leave, then how would you be able to leave? Like, real issues like that are obviously contributing factors for sure. But I think on a deeper level, when you have these kind of like signals going on, when you have this kind of conditioning going on, you have to fight against yourself, man. You have to fight against your own mind. And you have to fight against these knee-jerk reactions that cause you to regress back into parts of yourself that you feel like you barely have control over. Do you know how hard it is to leave a situation when you have that going on? Like, that's next level, man. That's next freaking level. And it's next level also because, like, most people out there would absolutely not be able to fight against that any better than the people who are in these types of situations. You know, like, the amount of self-control it takes, the amount of self-awareness it takes, like, you have to really learn how to navigate the smoke and mirrors of your own freaking mind. Because when your mind starts craving, a lot of these signals elicit some sort of craving, whatever that craving might look like. So now you're fighting against yourself. And when you do start craving, your brain will throw up all types of crazy ideas for what it thinks that you should do to get the drug, to get the food, the thing that you now feel like you need. Not that you want, that you need. It feels like a legitimate need when this stuff takes over. I mean, it's on a whole other, I almost want to say like biological level. It seems a little too extreme, but it's on a really deep level, deep subconscious kind of freaking level at this point. And it's hard. You know, there are times where like my brain will be like, you need to do some real crazy stuff right now to get me satisfied. And I really have to slow it down and be like, okay, first of all, play the tape out. What does that actually look like long term if you do all that stuff? Second of all, what kind of risk is involved in this? Like, could I get hurt? You know what I mean? Is there potential harm? And then more than anything, really, I just have to be like, does this even make sense? You know, does any of this make sense in what my brain's telling me to do right now? But also when I'm playing the tape out, like, what is my body or my mind scared is going to happen if I don't satisfy this need? Like, the other day when all this was happening to me, I literally drew out what I would call like an emotions map. Hold on, I'm gonna get it for you guys and I'm gonna like share it with you. So this was my emotions map. And I just drew out like all the different feelings that I was feeling. And it was really helpful to figure out like, okay, yeah, this is what I'm actually like wanting and thinking about. Like these are my surface level kind of like thoughts and emotions. But when I really like close my eyes and try and slow it down, what else am I like sensing internally? Like, am I sensing anger? Am I sensing fear? Am I sensing a desire to run away? You know, like I really tried to pay attention to like what I was feeling inside, which is very hard to do sometimes. And it actually helped me after I wrote it all out to see like the bigger picture of what was going on inside. So just an idea, something else you can do, because when this stuff takes over, it is so intense, as I know I keep saying. So I don't know if that would like help anyone, but that is one of the tools that I use. I also just find different things to supplement with. Sometimes I'll make myself go to sleep. Like it's not always a pretty picture of just like me doing yoga and like drinking water and just like thinking happy thoughts. You know, it's not always like that. Sometimes recovery is messy, and sometimes it's just turning to like a less terrible thing so that you don't turn to like the very, very, very terrible thing that you don't want to start again or engage in that literally almost ruined your life, you know, baby steps. So, pretty much all I had to say about that, I guess. But when you think about it from the aspect of classical conditioning, it makes so much sense. And I just think it's another way that people on the outside who are truly trying to understand just this strange phenomenon of abuse and all the different layers of it that come out of it that are so complex and confusing to understand, I think that really can maybe help them understand us even just a little bit more, because we all have been exposed to some sort of conditioning in our lives, even if it wasn't necessarily for this aspect of life. I think we all, well, I know just from advertising that we all have been exposed to it on some kind of level. But this really also helps me have a lot of mercy for myself as well, because it would be very confusing for me sometimes. Like I actually just had this happen to me a few weeks ago, and that's what caused me to begin to understand it enough that classical conditioning popped into my mind, because I've been doing a lot of work on myself for quite a few years now. I really have grown in a lot of different areas. I'm very proud of the work that I'm doing. You know, it's humbling, it's exhausting, but I'm getting there. Slowly, step by step, as we all are, I think. But I had this moment where a person that I used to be involved with, who meant a great deal to me, this was probably one of the hardest people for me to break off connection with, and they signaled something, and I wasn't thinking about it in those terms. So for me, I didn't see the behavior and go, oh, that's a signal. You know what I mean? It's going to trigger a craving. I didn't think that way. I just saw the signal, which felt like a fairly benign behavior. They basically signaled helplessness to me through a behavior. And I was shocked. I mean, shocked at the whole almost like body reaction that I had. It was both mental and physical, and it was so strong. The instant, I mean, seriously, nearly instant desire that I had to caretake for that person. And I've gone no contact with them. So that would mean not only would I be doing something, engaging in something that I didn't want to engage in, which is caretaking for a person who doesn't care about me, but that would mean breaking down a boundary, the no contact boundary, and actually going back to them to caretake, going back on my word. And I've been sticking to this boundary very successfully for quite a few months now. So this was a very big deal. It would be a very big deal. And I was just blown away at the level of craving that was there. And I didn't understand it. I felt a lot of shame about it. I really had to wrestle with this. A lot more than I've had to wrestle with cravings for drugs, more than I've even had to wrestle with cravings for other people. And I think it's because I've had such a complex history with this person, and to end that, it was very hard for me. So looking back on it now, I understand why the craving was as strong as it was, because there were multiple layers of things going on. But just like I referenced earlier, for me, the caretaking within this specific relationship reaped the biggest reward. And the reward was that after I caretook, if that's even a word, enough for them, I would actually get taken care of too. Like, I would get listened to, I would get, it would be reciprocated finally. And so I understood after thinking about it why my brain was kind of having this reaction. But for me, the interesting part was how quickly and strong it came on. Just like a trigger, but it was just different. It was just different. And I really, in that moment, literally thought about Pavlov's dogs. I was like, I am like a salivating dog. And the fact that I am like a salivating dog, like the behavior that he exhibited, it wasn't extreme helplessness. It was seriously fairly benign behavior. It was very mild. So the fact that he could exhibit such mild behavior and my body and my mind had such an extreme reaction, that's really what made me think of Pavlov's dogs. And I just feel like it's the perfect analogy. It's deeper than an analogy. It's literally the same thing in a different form, without question. The other aspect to this, I don't think it's true for all the signaling that happens, but it is true, I think, for getting the signals that indicate that our needs might get met afterwards, is a lot of these people are very inconsistent in how they show love when they actually choose to care about us. It's very unpredictable, and that's one thing that sometimes draws us in, right? The unpredictability of it. But from it being an unpredictable reward, and you not knowing when you're going to receive the reward, it's all very much based on them. They are the distributor of the food. If we're just going to run with the Pavlov's dogs analogy for a second, they're the person who's actually going to bring the food, right? And you don't know when the food's going to be brought. You don't know when they're actually going to, if they're going to love you that day, if they're going to be loyal to you that day. You don't know how the day is going to go, and how their attachment is actually going to look towards you, especially if you have a dismissive, avoidant partner. So because the reward is unpredictable, I think that also creates a scarcity mentality inside of us, to where we're desperate. We're far more desperate for the reward than I think a normal level of conditioning, if that makes sense. Like, this is just a theory. All my videos are me just fleshing out theories on camera. But when I've really tried to think about this, if we're going with the Pavlov's dogs analogy, okay, yes, there's a bell. Yes, we start salivating because we know food's coming soon. But there are some situations where the food's usually still always brought. Maybe not right away, but it is brought. So like, there is some amount of predictability to when the food will arrive, if not immediately. And even in other situations with classical conditioning, like let's say you see an advertisement that causes you to crave food or a specific kind of beverage, you get to choose when you go buy that. So there's not the same level of unpredictability going on because you're more so in control with when the reward arrives because it's dependent on you. You're the one who chooses to go get the reward for yourself after you've been exposed to the signal. Versus in this type of relationship that I'm describing, which is a bit more specific, you don't know when the reward's coming. You've now been triggered. Your craving has been triggered by the signal, and you don't actually know when the reward will come. And so because of that scarcity mentality, I think it causes an even more heightened version of craving, because if you get signaled somehow, we're just gonna run with caretaking for a second. Let's say that you get signaled that they're helpless and you now have the opportunity to caretake, and after the caretaking happens, they're gonna love you again. Let's say that you don't actually know when they're going to fully reach out and let you engage in the caretaking. And even after the caretaking happens, you don't know how much attention they'll actually give you. You don't know how much love you'll actually receive. You don't know what the love will actually look like. It's all very, very unpredictable. But you know that you will receive something. I think because there's so much anxiety and mystery and unpredictability mixed in with the potential for a reward, it causes even more complex emotions to be going on and attached to that kind of signaling, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. So just to go into what their specific signals can look like, and I did have to write this down, otherwise my brain literally just like ping pongs all over the place. But let's say they're signaling for you to become hyper submissive. They might indicate that they're about to become upset with you, withdraw. They might sort of signal anger, rage, potentially. You know, for every person, these signals look different. They're very unique to each person and to each situation. I think especially because like, they might act one way in a relationship because they found that that signal actually works for that person, versus in another relationship, that type of signal isn't effective at all. And that's where the shape shifting comes in. So the signals are very specific to each relationship. Like for me, if I'm thinking about the signals that would make me become hyper submissive, it was if I felt like the person was about to go into a rage, and also if they were going to become upset with me and then withdraw, to where I never knew when I would hear from them again after that, you know, how long they were going to withdraw for. I would definitely become hyper submissive as a way of trying to like control and mitigate that conflict so that they would actually stay. So the signal is that they signaled that they might be about to become mad at me, you know, or I could tell that they would just become distant. They would stop responding to my texts as quickly. Like they would make it very apparent that they were upset because I wouldn't be able to get in contact with them very much, which induces anxiety. So they signal that I become hyper submissive. What's the reward? You know, what is my reward for becoming hyper submissive if we're really fleshing this out? The reward is that if I become hyper submissive, there's not going to be a fight. There's potentially going to be less of a conflict than there would be if I didn't become hyper submissive. And their reward for me, when we look at what hyper submissiveness looks like, depending on what they're pissed off about, they might be mad that I'm actually engaging with someone that they feel jealous about, that I chose to engage in a hobby when they wanted me to just be spending time with them 24/7. You know, there's kind of this jealousy about any time being spent away from them. Just things like that. So the reward for them, if I become hyper submissive, is that I give up my hobbies. My hyper submissiveness looks like me giving up my hobbies, me not even making eye contact with men or acknowledging any of the men in the room. You know, it can go really extreme, and these are some things that I have done in the past. Isolating myself from people in my life who are important to me because they feel jealous if I spend time with even my friends or family outside of them. You know, all these different hyper submissive behaviors to where people on the outside are like, I feel like I never see you anymore. I feel like you don't have a life. You don't do the things that you used to love doing. You know, that's a hyper submissive reaction to different signals that they're giving off, which if you're around the couple, you might not even pick up on the signals that they're giving off because, again, these can be very mundane and more benign type of behaviors. But it just takes, it's a micro behavior that to the person who's with them, they know what that micro behavior indicates. And it's real fast what it triggers. So another one is them signaling us to be, that causes us to become anxious. They signal and I become anxious. And the reward there is if I become anxious and I need them again, because I think a lot of times when they want to induce anxiety, it's to regain control of a situation. So I'm feeling somewhat emotionally stable inside of myself. They don't like that. I might be exhibiting confidence. They don't like that. Whatever it is that's going on, it's almost like dogs in a park. You know, I heard that one way that dogs show dominance over each other is simply by nudging each other and knocking the other one off balance. I feel like that's a good analogy for what happens in these relationships, where they see that we're in too good of a mood, we're feeling too confident, whatever it is, they don't like it for how zen we are in our current state. And maybe that makes them feel inferior, insecure, whatever it is. And they need to signal something to cause us to feel anxious, to regain some of that power. So whatever that signal looks like, they signal anxiety. And the reward is that we go back to needing them. You know, it very much throws us off balance. And then we worry. We go back into a worried state of like, are they upset with me? Are things okay? Whatever it is, they regain power, which is their reward. And then we go into an anxious state, and our reward is eventually that we have to fix things so that they're okay with us again. So we go into reward seeking mode, and the eventual reward is that we pacify them or we talk things out, whatever it is, so that they're actually okay, so that we feel less anxious again. So our real reward for the anxiety inducing one is to relieve our own anxiety, to get the anxiety to go away. And there's typically only a couple of ways that we can do that, and it's usually by catering to them in whatever form that they're wanting. Another one, which is kind of similar, is they will intentionally trigger conflict. They will intentionally signal things to trigger conflict because they're addicted to conflict. So this can be flirting with another woman in front of you, or it can literally be micro behaviors like looking at a woman constantly in front of you, checking out the waitress in front of you. If they know that you're a naturally sort of like jealous person, they will play on that because they do like the conflict as a form of stimulation. And it took me a while to really pick up on this. For a while, I would blame myself for all of the fights that were happening. And it's not like I'm never responsible for a fight. But what I did start to notice is I would try very calmly to explain to them how if they did certain things, it made me feel a certain way, trying to meet in the middle, conflict resolve, talk things out, figure out how we can avoid, you know, different issues in the future. And after they learned that different things upset me, they not only would show zero effort to actually try to avoid these conflicts, but they would walk headfirst into them. They almost started pursuing the things that I had explained to them that bothered me. So signaling conflict is a very real thing that happens. And after a while, in some of these relationships, I started to feel like I was developing anger issues, which was very embarrassing for me because I felt like I was always getting into fights with them that I didn't want to get into because this anger was getting signaled and triggered inside of me. So the reward for them is that there is conflict. That is the literal reward. And the temporary reward for us, I think sometimes, is that we actually do get to experience a brief moment of advocating for ourselves. Like for me, anger is the thing that actually helped me successfully get away from these relationships. Anger was my saving grace. And I've talked about that in other videos where it's like, it's very important for you to have at least one thing, because you will slowly start becoming desensitized to so much in these relationships that it will become harder and harder for you to actually feel upset for yourself. You might feel mad at them for a moment, but feeling upset for yourself is a different thing. And we'll slowly start losing the ability to feel upset for ourselves in different areas. But hold on. You have to have one thing that is a deal breaker. And if you lose that, it's very hard to leave these relationships, I think, in some ways, because there's nothing that is the straw that will break the camel's back. There's no straw anymore. And I've always had at least one straw. The straws have been pretty extreme, so the relationships have had to get pretty bad before I leave, which is unfortunate, but I have had one last straw. And anger is the thing that finally motivated me enough to actually leave. So anger can be a good thing, but I will say in the moments where they signal conflict, that ended up, I think the reward for me was that it did create a kind of like cathartic release. It wasn't healthy, it wasn't good, But those were brief moments where I feel like I actually did advocate for myself a little bit. And even if I wasn't advocating for myself, like I said, it was some kind of release. So those are the two rewards for the two different people in that situation. And then the last one, which I think I've touched on the most in this, is when they signal for you to become the comforter, the nurturer. This is a huge need in these relationships because a lot of these men or women are so emotionally regressed that they do need a comforter and a nurturer. They are both an abuser and a child at the same exact time. And I do think that the child aspect to them is real. However, I have very little sympathy for it nowadays because it is a child that has run amok, a spoiled child that has been allowed to run amok for far too long. But I do think the emotionally regressed parts of themselves that need help regulating are very real. It's a very real problem for them. It's just not my problem. That's what therapy is there for. So yeah. Anyway, I've done the work and they should too. But yeah, so the last signal is signaling you to become a comforter. They can initiate this in many different ways, but usually it is by feigned helplessness in some form or another. There might be other ways that they signal for you to become a comforter that I'm not thinking of. If you can think of something, feel free to leave it in the comments down below. But they do signal for us to become the comforter. And if you think about it in terms of us and for us and what our reward is that we get very brief intimacy, a feeling of real intimacy and connection and love from doing this, especially if we are in starvation mode and in scarcity mentality mode and we aren't really receiving that a lot. This is a brief moment where this can imitate some version of intimacy. It's not real intimacy. It's a very selfish version of intimacy that revolves around them, but it's the closest thing we can come to, so we'll freaking take it. And then sometimes, like I said, they will actually care very briefly or pretend to care very briefly about our needs as well after we fed them. So that's our reward. And then obviously for them, the reward for them is that they actually get fed. They actually get comforted. They actually get nurtured. And I also think that this is the biggest way that they handle us and control us inside of the relationship. So it's also the most effective tool that's used, the most effective signal that's used to signal to us to revert when we're thinking about leaving. This is the most dangerous one, in my opinion, the one that holds most people hostage for so long within these relationships is this type of signaling. And this type of signaling is deeply ingrained inside of me, and it's definitely one that I'm trying to undo the most because I do have a caring heart. I like helping people feel better. I like helping my friends work through their problems. I love people doing that for me too. It's not one-sided. I don't just want to be like a therapist for everyone. I just love to help people. I love to talk through things with people. You know, I love when they let me do that. When it's both equally reciprocated, it's a really beautiful thing. But the toxic part of it is this side to it where I just let myself be exploited and get some sort of like high out of it, you know, and that's a very obviously unhealthy and extremely dysfunctional version of something that can be very beautiful when it's mutual. So becoming aware of just like the starvation mode of all of this is really important. Really seeing how we can be like starving, salivating dogs who are seeing and hearing bells, but never know when they're actually going to receive the reward and are so desperate for any kind of reward that they'll just take anything to satiate the craving that has been triggered. That's a very real issue that I think summarizes a lot of different problems that I've run into in my life. A lot of different problems I've run into can be summarized in that sentence that I just said that I totally forgot. I don't even remember what I just said. Great. But anyway, I don't know if this video is like helpful. I feel like I wasn't too all over the place because I kind of like mapped all of this out because it was kind of complex to figure out how to like talk about all of it. I swear, like if you guys could see inside my head and what it looks like it's so weird because I can like see all this stuff very clearly inside my mind for what it is and like what it looks like, but trying to figure out how to like translate it into words and then putting it into like a concise like thought pattern and everything. Like I think one reason I don't make videos more often is because it's so overwhelming just trying to like translate it into concise, organized thoughts that follow a train of thought that like actually makes sense and is actually in ways that like someone can understand. Because in my mind, it's very much like pictures and I don't know, like feelings and different things, and I can like see it, but to like get it out here into video form can just be like really difficult sometimes. So yeah, hopefully like all of that made sense, hopefully. And anyway, yeah, thanks as always for watching, and God bless.